Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Even as more Western states support Palestinian statehood, will this do anything to change the horrendous situation on the ground, especially as long as the United States opposes? Let's get to the bottom line. For decades, the United States helped sculpt and prop up the aspiration of a two-state solution for Palestinians and Israelis. But under the presidency of Donald Trump, many of the pretenses of U.S. policy have just been thrown out the window, chief among them that the Palestinians have any right to determine their own future. Israel has full U.S. support as it opens a new chapter in the carnage right now in Gaza to destroy whatever's left of Gaza City. Israeli forces have ordered hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to evacuate, again, even though most consider that fleeing may be worse than staying. And the chances of being killed by Israeli forces are mounting higher and higher every day, no matter where they go. So has American involvement in the Middle East only made things worse? And after October 7th, have Palestinians and Israelis passed the point of any possible deal to share the land and coexist peacefully? Today, we're talking with Rob Malley, who served as a U.S. negotiator in the Middle East for decades, and he's author of a brand new book that's just come out on his experiences. Tomorrow is Yesterday: Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. Rob, it's great to have you in studio here today, and congratulations on a very sobering book. And I just want to get right to it. I want to start with where we're at right now in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Israeli-Palestinian journey that you say is linked to decisions that have gone way back, that October 7th may be the latest chapter, but there are so many elements in this story that go back over the decades you've been a negotiator. And I'd love you to give our viewers a kind of Reader's Digest condensed version, if you wouldn't mind, of how the horror we're seeing today is related to failure after failure in negotiations over this land.
So, Steve, thanks for having me. And Hussein Agha and I wrote this book to answer, to a large extent, the question you just asked. Where are Israelis and Palestinians today, and why? So where are they today? And you already sort of prefigured it in what you said. Palestinians are being forced to flee and flee from the place they fled. They're being struck and attacked in the places where they were told to take refuge from the latest attack. In the West Bank, we're seeing communal violence, settlers, often with the backing of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, expelling Palestinians from their land. We're seeing Palestinians adrift, at a loss, taking matters in their own hands often, and trying to see with whatever means they have, which are today few and far between.
I mean, not to interrupt, you say in the very beginning of the book that the fighters that the Israelis forces have been targeting seem like collateral damage in a much bigger story.
I mean, you know, it's hard to look at what's happening in Gaza and not reach that conclusion. But just to complete the picture, so we're seeing communal violence, we're seeing Israelis who think after October 7th that the Palestinians have one desire, which is to eradicate them. For people of my generation, of your generation, of Hussein's generation, it's hard to look at all of this and not say, we've seen it before. Even the vocabulary, which may seem new to our young listeners and viewers, is an echo from the past. Genocide, apartheid, Zionism is racism, ethnic cleansing, the Nakba, the catastrophe, pogroms, all of that is an echo from the past, is a throwback to the past. And why is that? Like, how could it be that 30-some-odd years after the handshake in the White House lawn between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, how come we're back to where we were? It's because that peace process that you described, the U.S.-led peace process, ended up being a mirage. It was fleeting. It was evanescent. It had no resonance with what was happening on the ground. It didn't change what was happening on the ground. It was a lot of hot air. And that's sort of the book tries to describe how we got from where we were to where we are and why we are back, hence the title of the book, Tomorrow's Yesterday. Everything we're seeing today we've seen in the past, including, by the way, what Israel has just recently done when they tried to kill Hamas leaders in Doha. Again, you don't have to have a long memory to remember when Israel was attacking Palestinians, trying to kill them in Paris, in Berlin, in Tunis, in Beirut, any and all Palestinians who they believed were directly or indirectly involved in attacks against Israel. And sometimes, as you say, the collateral damage was just as significant as a targeted killing.
So what gave it so much momentum? I've self-disclosure, I've known you for decades. We've had many, many forums on the challenge of getting Israel and Palestine peace and justice, a two-state solution, et cetera, in place, worked with very good people along the way. But one of the things I realized was that the Israeli-Palestinian peace business was a business that needed to go out of business. A long time ago, I sort of felt that. I felt like it was self-perpetuating, that there was something odd about it that wasn't focused on real resolution or real truths. I was in a minority at that time. You were in the room where all of this was happening, and you were part of this peace business. So tell us about that part of it.
Very good point. And Hussein was on it from a different angle. He was on the
yeah. Your co-author was working with Mahmoud Abbas and Yasser Arafat,
and he was in almost every significant encounter between Israelis and Palestinians back since way well before Oslo. So to some extent, the book is introspective and self-critical. I mean, we were part. I'll speak about myself. I was part of that theater, right? I mean, and
you were part of a charade.
And not, at some point maybe I knew it and I denied it to myself. At some point I don't think I knew it and I was blind and naive. And part of the book is about how self-delusion, illusion, deceit, and lies are a continuum, and it's unclear when one becomes the other. But at some point, it had to be obvious to leaders in the U.S., and you started off with leaders in Europe who are calling for recognition of a Palestinian state. It must have become obvious to leaders in Western Europe as well that to simply repeat the mantra, two states, irreversible path to peace, when everything on the ground is moving in another direction, that ceases to become a delusion and it becomes a lie.
You say in the book that nonetheless, even though you think that really you had to go back to even before 1948, that 1967 wasn't enough, you need to look at those impulses, and you needed, I think one of the most powerful parts of your book was you had to understand that the language and approach and methodology that the Israeli negotiators and the Americans were taking was something deeply hostile in a sense to the way Palestinians were looking at their loss and their grievance over what happened. It was a very interesting perspective that frankly I hadn't seen before. But as you kind of go through that and you kind of look at it, you nonetheless argue that there were moments where you might have gotten a deal. You might have gotten something. And you kind of put a lot of blame on both sides, if you will, saying, there were a lot of illusion in this, but the moments where it could have happened, the U.S. became unserious. And where, so I'm interested in that.
Yeah, and you're touching on sort of a tension in the book, and part of it is because we were both, Hussein and I, insiders and outsiders. And so on the one hand, I think we could take a step back and say so much of this was built on illusions and on the fact that Israelis and Palestinians were speaking a different language and that the U.S. was certainly not in a position to interpret one for the other. In fact, it sided much more often than not with the Israelis, culturally, ideologically, politically, strategically. But you raise this tension. Were there moments? I mean, if we spend time describing some of those moments, but also saying that at heart this was a process built on thin air, it's because the two-state solution, as defined in the peace process, was not a natural landing place for either Israeli Jews or for Palestinians. The aspiration of Palestinians way back, and back from 1948 onwards, was not to have a Palestinian state in the borders of 67. It was a dream of liberation, return, redemption, justice. And the Zionist dream at the outset is not the borders of 67 either. In fact, this is something Hussein pointed out to me years ago. If you ask Israelis who are core believers in their, in Zionism, they would say Hebron in the West Bank and what they call Judea and Samaria is more important to us than Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv doesn't have that biblical significance. Hebron does. So these borders of 67, this two-state solution, it doesn't really speak to their yearning either, and it doesn't address or fulfill their desire for absolute normalcy, absolute security, which is hard to distinguish from absolute supremacy. So the peace process was trying to force something down the throats of Israelis and Palestinians who didn't really want to go there. And it would have taken, and maybe there was a world in which it was possible, a much more forceful, adept American hand to guide them there. And as we describe, the Americans were, sometimes spectators, sometimes actors, biased on one side, blind to their own bias. And you and I, as you say, we know each other from a long time. This goes back to the years when I worked for President Clinton. And I don't know that it was, it wasn't necessarily bad faith, but I think, as we say, the U.S. didn't view itself as others did and didn't realize the extent to which its biases were warping the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians.
Was Clinton smart enough to know that this was a hoax, that he was engaged in gimmicks?
No, I don't think he felt it that way. But I give one example. I don't think it's in the book, but one thing that really struck with me was when we were discussing at the end of Camp David, when the Camp David summit fails, and the president has a conversation with Yasser Arafat. And
this is Camp David, where you have Yasser Arafat, you have Ehud Barak, you have President Clinton,
exactly.
And you're a primary player and communicator as someone who was well known to be popular in the Arab world, working for Bill Clinton.
Yeah, I don't know how well known, but maybe after the fact. But I was pretty junior at the time, but I was in the room, and I remember President Clinton telling Yasser Arafat, you didn't make a single concession, you came here and you just stood there. And Arafat said, what do you mean? We accepted the borders of 67. We even accepted, he said, that Israeli settlements, Jewish settlements, what Israelis call neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, could be part of Israel if we have two states. And the president sort of, I could see on his face, and he said to Arafat, those aren't concessions. That's just recognition of reality. Of course you're going to have, of course the Jewish neighborhoods are going to be part of Israel, which, I understood he genuinely believed that. But it is
so they were going past each other.
Because
they were.
There was a misunderstanding of the fact that for Palestinians, accepting the borders of 67 is a vast historic compromise. I mean, it is something that for many Palestinians today, even today, is unacceptable. But Arafat sold it as sort of this was how.
So let me ask you an uncomfortable question. A lot of Israeli friends that I had, and I talked to you about this, said they lost the war. They lost the war, and thus they're not able to be definitive.
The Palestinians lost the war.
The Palestinians lost the war. Yeah. They lost the war. There was displacement. Yeah. This is still reconciling, frankly, the consequences of the attacks on Israel at that time and the loss of war. How does that fit into the equation of an eventual just peace?
And 100%. And again, we try to the extent we can to do justice to Israeli perceptions. I mean, from their vantage point, and I think this was Ehud Barak, the prime minister at Camp David, but also other leaders, they won, right? They won. And since when do the ones who win, have to concede land to the ones who lost? So it was out of their magnanimity, out of the benevolence that they were saying, okay, you could have an authority, maybe even a state with very limited sovereignty on a large part of the West Bank and Gaza, but this is a gift we're giving you. That whole approach, of course, was not something that the Palestinians could digest, right? They believed it was their due, that was their right, they had been dispossessed of their land, and they weren't even getting everything that was their due if they got 67, because many of them still believe that refugees should have the right to return, that the borders should, that all of Palestine should be theirs. So there was this basic, the whole negotiations were about two very different things. On the Israeli side, it was, what are the terms of surrender that the Palestinians are going to agree to? What do we have to pay them off so that they get out of our way? And for the Palestinians, it was, how can we get a measure of justice, of redemption after the catastrophe of 1948? And again, it doesn't mean that there's no solution. It means that if you ignore those historical narratives, the yearnings of both sides, and you sort of pretend that you could draw a line on the map and say, and then tie a bow over it and say, hey, it's all done. Palestinians will live in parts of the West Bank and Gaza with minimal sovereignty, no right of return. Israel will get some degree of security and safety, and that's it. That doesn't speak to what Israelis and Palestinians have been fighting about and care about for so long.
So you worked for a lot of U.S. presidents. Now, in my book, there were a lot of Democratic presidents. So Bill Clinton, you worked for Barack Obama, you worked for Joe Biden. You also worked closely with Secretary of State John Kerry,
sure,
in these various ways. I guess my friendly question is, as you kind of look at the various ways, I mean, I think a lot of presidents, just like President Trump, see peacemaking as a way to get a Nobel Peace Prize, which apparently some presidents still want to get. And they found Palestine as an important part of their strategic dashboard, that they couldn't completely ignore Palestine and needed to do something broadly in the region. Knowing what you know and knowing what I've just read in your book, you always doubted, actually, their ability to come to terms and, do these things. And so I guess my question to you is, particularly when we saw, after October 7th, an incredible reaction by the Israeli security forces into Gaza, the death of tens and tens of thousands of innocent people in that process, why did Joe Biden do virtually nothing?
I mean, that's a very good question. I was not working for him at the time, I was not.
No, but you had been part of that administration earlier.
Yeah.
You had been a debate partner of Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. You knew these people intimately. And when people look back and say, why didn't the President of the United States use their leverage at that moment in any consequential way to even pretend that the hoax that you didn't like might be an option, because things went off that cliff?
Yeah. No, absolutely, and you're 100% right. And I think it's a shame that the Biden administration is going to have to live with, because they failed wholly at that duty, at that primary duty, which is to avoid what happened in Gaza. There's several explanations. I think there are the habits, the cultural, ideological, strategic habits of American policymaking, which in this case were magnified by the fact that You know Joe Biden, you know former President Biden, he comes from an era where, and he said it so many times, his gut, he feels solidarity with Israel. And he also comes from a time, frankly, where the politics in this country were unidirectional. You could only pay for being critical of Israel, and you could only gain by being supportive of Israel. And I think that was still part of his, sort of the way he looked at the world. And added to that, as a number of his colleagues have said, he just has this inherent intrinsic solidarity with Israel. I recount one episode early on in the Obama administration when he was vice president and when we were arguing to try some effort to try to bring the Israelis and Palestinians together and try to work towards a two-state solution. And he looked at me, and he's the ultimate realist in that sense. And he looked at me with what I describe as a mix of sympathy and disdain, which was, you may care about this, but the world has moved on. Even your Arab friends don't care about the Palestinian issue anymore. So I don't think he felt that it was a strategic necessity to get a two-state solution. I also thought that he thought it was a quixotic attempt. It would never happen. And when October 7th happened, his sympathies were naturally with the Israelis, particularly when they were attacked by an organization that he views as a terrorist organization. And so that's where all his sympathies went. And then as the time went on, and I would talk to some of the members of the administration, I think they concluded the only thing we could do that might have an impact on Israel is something we will not do, which is withhold military assistance, maybe vote against them at the United Nations Security Council. But the main, and we say this in the book, you can't on the one hand say you want to end the war and continue to provide the weapons that allow the war to continue. That's a basic contradiction. And once the administration concludes that's somewhere where we're not going to go, for strategic reasons, because they feel that it would put Israel in too weak a position, and for political reasons, because they felt the fear of the blowback at home. Once you're not prepared to cross that, then everything else becomes an exercise in futility. I mean, it is true that the White House tried to get more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And they will say that they tried hard, they were on the phone every day. But there was one phone call they weren't prepared to make, which is to tell the Prime Minister, if you don't fundamentally change the situation in Gaza, we're going to withhold military assistance.
Has the Arab world done enough to stand with the Palestinians? I know the UAE stepped up recently and drew a red line over annexing the West Bank.
Over annexing the West Bank.
And
not over
that's
what's
one
happening
thing, but it's
in Gaza.
not about Gaza. We've also seen reports about elements of this in the two-state solution and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. But I'm interested in Jordan and Egypt and the broader Middle East, that I want to be careful in my language. Their engagement in this seems to not be as deep as it might be to have a more consequential impact.
Yes, and I think you're being diplomatic. I think listen to Palestinians. They feel, particularly in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, they feel betrayed, they feel abandoned, they feel at a loss, they feel alone, which is also a throwback to the past. If you look at 1948, despite all these claims that the Arab world would come to save the Palestinians, they were left very much to their own devices. I think to look at something, if we want to be more optimistic or positive, and by the way, both Hussein and I believe that Israelis and Palestinians are doomed to coexist. And there will be someday, we believe, some form of peaceful coexistence, but we're going to have to change almost everything about how the conflict has been addressed. But one thing that could happen now with the Palestinians bereft of a national...
I mean, I just want to interrupt. You're deeply critical of it. You said corruption is the lifeblood of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Palestinian Authority.
Yes, absolutely.
And that everything with any ounce of legitimacy that currently stands is just gone, just faded.
Right. So the Palestinians don't have a leadership. They don't have any institutions that are representative that they believe in. So this is a time, if there's ever a time for the Arab world to step up, to use the leverage it has with the Israelis, with the Americans, it's now. Let's see. I'm not going to start. I'm not a prophet. I don't know where they'll go, but maybe they were reminded from what happened in the last 2 years, what happens when they let this situation rot and they don't step up to their own responsibilities.
Rob, UN General Assembly is coming up. And we've seen a lot of theater and kabuki over many UN General Assemblies over Palestine. Is this session different because you've got France, Belgium, the UK, Canada, Australia, all pledging essentially to recognize Palestine as a state? After reading your book, I'm wondering, are they perpetuating a kind of illusion about what's possible? Do you look at it as constructive, what they're doing, or does it do more damage in the long run?
So the short answer to your question is they are perpetuating the illusion. Now, on one level you could say, well, this shows enormous international attention and focus on this issue, which has been absent for far too long. But is this the right kind of attention? Perpetuating, as you say, this mythology about the two-state solution? I mean, I don't understand, and Hussein and I have written about this separately, how people think that by recognizing a state that doesn't exist, that is not close to coming into existence, and that whose existence will depend on Israel accepting it. You know, the outside world is not going to say Palestine exists. Israel came into existence not just because of a vote at the UN. It came into existence by force of arms. That's how Israel came into being. So this notion that we're going to simply say, the world is going to say, we believe in a two-state solution, we recognize a Palestinian state, that's just not serious. And it's, you know, instead of people making a difference, they're making themselves feel good. Now, again, I think for some Western European countries, this is a good faith effort. You know, look at Spain, because they're not just doing this. They're also taking concrete action to do what they can, which is not much, to stop what's happening in Gaza. But for others, the only priority today should be to stop the onslaught on Gaza. That should be the number 1, 2, and 3 priority. Everything else is a distraction. For some, the distraction is inadvertent, it's mistaken. For others, it seems to be the purpose, to show the world, hey, we're doing something, to feel good about having done something, rather than feeling good for making a difference. So my question to you, to anyone who is, you know, to people who are looking at that is, how is recognition of a Palestinian state going to change the lives of a single Gazan, of a single Palestinian living in the West Bank? How is it going to make the situation any better? And then, finally, one more word is when you look at the conditions that some countries are attaching to this recognition. Some are saying, we're recognizing as long as Hamas is not in power, we're recognizing it as long as the Palestinians reform. What kind of recognition is that? Either it's the right of the Palestinians to have their state, or it's not. You don't sort of make it subordinate to the kind of government they have. And likewise, when you hear the Prime Minister of the UK say, we'll recognize it unless Israel takes certain actions. Again, it doesn't make any sense. Conditional recognition doesn't make any sense. It's a sign of the fact that this is being used for purposes that have nothing to do with an actual resolution of the conflict.
So what's the option, Rob? I mean, what you're basically saying is that on paper, the world wants to recognize Palestine as a state, wants the International Criminal Court to move things, wants these things to happen. But the truth is they're largely shrugging about Palestinian lives. They're really stepping back as thousands of people are dying, as they're watching the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, you know, use these as shooting galleries for people trying to get food. You're very, very dismissive of the peace processes that we've had in place as having been wrong-footed, hoaxes, et cetera. What do you think some real options are?
So first I'll say, and you know, we spoke about it earlier, I think Hussein and I have been participants, direct, indirect, of a failed process. So there's a lot of humility that has to come with that. And we're not here saying we have a blueprint, we have a prescription. Frankly, I think nobody has.
You make very clear that you don't actually have a clear one. You say there are possibilities.
And I think the first step is to recognize the true nature of this conflict on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, what they are really fighting about, rather than pretend that we have this solution. So let's understand the nature of this beast, what this conflict is about, and then there are other possibilities that could open up. Possibilities in terms of what the outcome could be. And we have a range of them, not that we are advocating them, but the most likely outcome is a perpetuation of the status quo. But then there are others. Is there a form of confederation, loose confederation between Israel and Palestine, Palestine and Jordan? Are there other outcomes? Some people would argue for binational state. Who knows, right? And we just say we need to have our minds open to different possibilities, because the two-state solution is the only one that has been tried, and it failed. So that's number one. But there are also other things that I think we need to have our minds open to. Who are the participants in this process? The peace process has been kind of the exclusive preserve of a slice of Palestinians and a slice of Israelis. What about those forces that are, in a way, more active, more capable of changing things? Israelis, settlers, religious Zionists, Palestinian Islamists, members of the diaspora, the refugee community, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They've not been part of this, and yet the conflict...
So you want to include all the rejectionists?
Well, rejectionists. We need to include those who could do the most harm to the process that has failed so far. And then also, who should the mediator be? And so there's a lot of questions that we need to ask ourselves rather than accept the straitjacket of the past. I know the situation today looks horrendous, and so people want something easy, neat, a quick fix. The quick fixes are what got us to where we are, so let's not repeat that.
A friend of mine who was a very top official of the Biden administration said that the current arrangement in Israel has only an on switch, and that the only thing that can turn it off is America, that America is Israel's off switch at this moment. When you kind of look at it, what Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister has achieved, extraordinary intelligence coups with Hezbollah, of setting things in motion where you've seen a change in government in Syria, assassinations inside Iran. To a certain degree, a lot of people are celebrating Netanyahu as the person who has changed the map for Israel and the possibilities of what is there and what Israel's security situation will look like. You've also seen, I think we're up to 7 nations now in the Middle East where this conflict has expanded. So the footprint has expanded there. How do you deal with that question? If Benjamin Netanyahu, on a roll, has unconditional love from the United States and the White House, whatever turns it off?
Again, a very good question, and we say in the book that from Israel's perspective, why not continue? The status quo has actually been quite profitable to them. I would say, and again, this is something that I think Israelis and Americans and others should think about. There's no such thing as a victory and then you move on to something else. Particularly in the Middle East, the movie is just beginning. And could you imagine, I know you know this, the generation of Palestinians, but not just Palestinians, who have been brought up with only one memory now, the horrors of Gaza. And what thirst for vengeance they're going to have and what they're going to try to do. And is that the future that Israel wants? Their project is to be accepted as a normal, safe state in the Middle East. How can you do that when you have so much hatred that you fueled? So I wouldn't take, you're right, to point to all the triumphs of Israel over the last 2 years. You left out, degrading in massive way Iran's nuclear program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what does that mean for the future? And that's, we've seen from our own U.S. experience and from Israel's experience in the region, victories in the short term could lead to something very, very different in the longer term. So that's number one. You asked the question about the off switch and the off ramp. Yes, I mean, the U.S. is a core actor. It's not the only one, and we spoke earlier about what Arab countries could do, and they have not done a fraction of what they could try to do to try to put pressure on Israel and on the U.S. to exercise that off switch. It's a question we haven't gotten into, is sort of the enigma of President Trump. I have to say, when he came into office a second time, Hussein and I were wondering, is he somebody who could actually do something different, break with convention? He defies the laws of political gravity. You know that better than I do. He's not a prisoner of the conventions of our foreign policy.
Not at all.
History. At all, because he doesn't have that history. He's driven by other things. And so there was this notion that perhaps he could put the kind of pressure on Netanyahu to achieve, normalization with Saudi Arabia, Palestinian statehood, whatever it may be. He has not done that. He's broken some taboos, in particular accepting direct negotiations with Hamas, which was no other president was prepared to contemplate. But beyond that, he has seemed to acquiesce and even more enabled, promoted Israeli designs, which are not going to lead to what he says he wants, which is a ceasefire and the deepening of the Abraham Accords. So for me, it's still an enigma. I think there's some answers one could think of, but it's, he had the capacity, he still does. So far, he has certainly not exercised it at all.
Let me ask you, and I'm going to ask this delicately. Bernie Sanders, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Chris has been on this show and said the United States is culpable in the disaster that's unfolding in Gaza and the Middle East, that we have responsibility. Sanders has said the same thing. There's something I've done a lot of shows on, the Leahy Law. It was looking at the use of weapon systems sold by the United States having to conform to our humanitarian standards. Many people resigned from the State Department and the Department of Defense, knowing, in fact, that law was not being abided by the Biden administration. You've been part of this mix for a long time. And you were a victim of this system, too. You were out there trying to negotiate the JCPOA, some version of it coming back. And I'm just interested in, my word would be the duplicity of administrations. I don't know what yours would be. But
it's not about
false efforts, false dimensions. You were attacked and you lost your security clearance. You were put on the sidelines for some of this stuff. I'm interested in the swirl of policymaking, of those people earnestly trying to basically make things better and move forward in a way that's consistent with the law, consistent with America's role, with the sense of humanitarianism that a lot of Americans believe they have, versus something more insidious that often ends up being the case. I'd love to get your take on it.
It's a great question. We could go on for another several hours. I want to put my personal case aside, but I think there's enough fodder without that. And you're right. And what Senator Sanders has said, what Senator Van Hollen is right, we are culpable, absolutely culpable. And the Trump administration has made things much worse. But the Biden administration paved the way. It normalized, it accepted forms of Israeli behavior, and it continued to provide Israel with the weapon to continue to do what it's doing. So yes, one could say President Trump has brought it to a different level. But there's a greater continuity than discontinuity in that respect. And I think it's something that Biden administration officials need to reflect upon for a very, very long time. Now, the explanation, again, it goes to a little bit what we were saying earlier. I think there are these strategic habits, cultural habits, political habits. There's this foreign policy sort of reference, what Ben Rhodes called the blob, which is hard to escape. It's hard to escape. It's the safe place to be. It corresponds to a certain perception of American interests, of American muscular interests in the region. I would say that it has disserved the U.S. far more than it has served it. And I think this, when President Obama said when he was running, we need to change not just end the war in Iraq, but the mindset that led to the war. We've only scratched that surface. That mindset still exists of how we deal with the Middle East, of how we treat people in the Middle East. And as you say, the deceit, I forget what the word you use, but I agreed with that
duplicity.
word, the duplicity of not following our own law.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, it starts with self-delusion, it becomes an illusion, it becomes deceit, it ends up a lie. And that's really the point that Hussein and I made. And this is not a personal indictment of anyone in particular. I think it's a systemic issue. It's a systemic issue about U.S. foreign policy. And if we want to play a different role, we're going to have to have a different way of thinking and acting.
Can Israel kill its way out of this?
I mean, I don't know what you mean exactly by that.
Well, what I mean by this, there are millions of Palestinians. You have there's been a fear in Israel of a demographic time bomb. Clearly in Gaza, there's a focus. There's a lot of human death there, but I think we're in the 60 to 70,000 range right now, which is extraordinary. Also, efforts to move, to dislocate, to have other nations take Palestinians and repatriate them somewhere else. That's the wrong word, but relocate them somewhere else. But in that process, can Palestine be seriously depopulated?
Listen, I mean, I would say at this point anything is possible, and we are much closer to the possibility of an ethnic cleansing than we've been in some time. But again, that's an echo from the past, because if you look at the conflict at the beginning, that was very much the ambitions of sometimes both sides, right? To eradicate, to wake up one morning and the other side will no longer be there. So when we say tomorrow's yesterday, that's what we mean, that some of these ideas which were considered, or you never mention them in good company, they're now being mainstreamed to some extent. Idea of the Riviera in Gaza, etc. Now, can Israel truly succeed? Can it really get rid of itself of its Palestinian problem through force of arms? That's where I go back to what I said earlier. Palestinians are not going to go away. They're not going to get rid of the millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And you're going to have a generation of Palestinians who at this point will have learned that they have nothing to lose. And the only memory they have is the memory of the catastrophe, of this catastrophe in Gaza and what's unfolding in the West Bank. That is not a comfortable place for Israel to be. They may believe, and I understand it. And again, you said it earlier, they believe they won. They won. They won back in 48. They won again in 67. They won again now after October 7th. Why should they be the ones who have to pay the price for the victories that they have achieved? But if they want normalcy, if the Zionist project of normalcy, in one way or another, whether it's one state, two states, three states, whatever it is, you cannot do this on the backs and at the expense of another people.
So I have listened to former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, former Shin Bet chiefs, former Mossad chiefs, former foreign ministers, members of the Supreme Court in Israel, the highest court, all talk about what they see as the insanity of the current course. Yeah. And most of them reflecting that we have to have some sense of a shared future with Palestinians and build that back somehow. I'm interested in what you think about that comment, because I think it's easy to get lost in the fact that Israel has an orthodoxy about this moment as opposed to a debate going on inside Israel. Do these other voices matter? Is there any sense that you feel that Israel could actually come back to a view where they basically realize they need to share?
I mean, first, come back would assume that they were ever at a place where that either side contemplated the real kind of sharing that you're referring to. I wish that those voices in Israel mattered more, and there's some very courageous voices in Israel. But for the most part, and again, we say this in the book, this is not Netanyahu's war, and it hasn't been Netanyahu's war. This is Israel's war. The wall-to-wall support from opposition, from left to right, again, with some exceptions, some courageous exceptions. After October 7th, there was very little dissent. And to the degree there is dissent, it's over Netanyahu's judicial reform, and it's over his deprioritization of the return of hostages. So it's not so much, what the hell are we doing to the Palestinians? How can we be guilty of this? It's, what about our hostages? What about us? What about our isolation in the international community? By the same token, on the Palestinian side, again, we say this is not Hamas's war. This was not these messianic people who had this idea. This was Palestinian through and through, this notion that finally we need to get the Israelis to pay the price for everything that we've endured. So we were captives, they're going to be captives. We were the victims of violence, they're going to be the victims of violence. They invaded our territory, we're going to invade theirs. And to the degree you're hearing some Palestinians and more voices among the Palestinian side that are critical, it's less what did we do to the Israelis, but more couldn't Hamas have predicted what Israel would do to us in return. So on both sides there's much more of a what is it doing to us than what it's doing to them. And you know, my colleague, my co-author Hussein Aga likes to refer to this, we're back to where this has been, a biblical conflict between two sides that only have violence and the spilling of blood as their horizon. But that's not because they are sort of ancient hatreds, religious hatreds they can never get over it. No, it's because the efforts to resolve this conflict have missed the boat. They were barking up the wrong tree. And as I said in response to your first question, it's been a lot of hot air. And so nothing has been done to change the realities on the ground, the attitudes, the emotions of the two people. And so we're back.
I mean, the book is riveting. And I want to tell the audience the book is riveting. There are parts in it like the Camp David negotiations, the role you played, Arafat's calculations in various ways, and your own critique of the process, which you published in the New York Review of Books later with the same author, I think was extraordinary history. Some of it I did not know and really appreciate. But it raises the question, missing the boats has been the story all along. Yeah. Lots of missed boats, no plan Bs. And it brings me to my final question, which is, time is on whose side in this story?
You know, both sides believe that time is on their side, and they believed it for a long time. The Israelis felt that force of arms would ultimately subdue the Palestinians. I mean, go back to Jabotinsky, go back to the early Zionists in Israel. They felt, you know, build an iron wall, impose our will on the Palestinians. They will understand sooner or later who's the boss, who has the power, and they'll have to acquiesce to our domination. And the Palestinian side, and this has long been their view, over time we have demography on our side, we have geography on our side. They can't make us disappear, and so ultimately we'll prevail. You know, the one party that time is not on the side of are the civilians on both sides who have suffered the consequence of these calculations. So I don't know if anyone has truly time on their side. You know, the sooner we realize and we get rid of the dogmas and the mythologies and the lies of the past, and that Israelis and Palestinians resume a different kind of conversation, that different actors, Arab actors in particular, get back into the mix and try to seriously view this as a priority, to try to find some kind of arrangement. And again, the notion of peace between Israelis and Palestinians today may sound far-fetched, but some kind of peaceful coexistence, some kind of arrangement, so we don't see the suffering and the death and the destruction that we're seeing today.
Well, Rob Malley, longtime negotiator in this Middle East story, and he's published this really great new book with Hussein Aga that he's written. Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. Thank you for doing the book. It's very sobering, depressing, parts of it hopeful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. It really was good talking to you.
So what's the bottom line? My guest today has been involved with the U.S.-Palestine-Israel negotiations for decades, and he argues that for the most part, America's just never had a sincere hand when it came to a just outcome. The U.S. has never tried to solve the Rubik's Cube problem of Israel's founding and Palestine's loss in 1948, nor tried to really create a healthy situation after the 1967 war. And he argues that the biggest hoax, and he was involved, was the peace process that was supposed to lead to a two-state solution, led exclusively by the United States. So what can be done now? Well, the world could start by doing away with these illusions and limitations, allow for wider involvement, create an honest approach that deals with the core challenges of all sides and all players, even if some of them are unsavory in Washington's eyes. It's fine that France, the UK, Canada, Australia, and others are recognizing Palestinian rights. But if they're not willing to back it up like they back Israel, it has no more chance of happening now than at the high point of the Oslo Accords pageant. And that's the bottom line.